Hi, this is Sean Wildemuth with Agilitrain. In this first module of using less in SAS, I want to explore CSS and talk about some of the pain points that makes building style sheets for web development difficult. Let's touch on some of these pain points. We're going to first talk about the color problem, and that is how CSS doesn't allow us to have named colors so that we have to repeat colors throughout our CSS and then do search and replaces later when our design changes in fundamental ways. Duplication issues in that there are no way to create reusable sections in CSS to be used in different part of our design. Cascading avalanches, and that's where it's difficult to see exactly where a cascaded rule is coming from. We can certainly debug it, but it's very hard by looking at the CSS to make sure we know what rules are going to be applied in what cases. Lack of calculation, CSS doesn't allow us to base values on arbitrary formulas. And finally, we're going to talk about imports and how imports, browser cache, and other things can make CSS harder to manage in the long term. The nature of cascading style sheets is that they're declarative, which means they're fairly easy to write by hand. In most cases, you're going to be defining the rules for different parts of your web design using these style sheets, setting up rules and values in those rules. It becomes very easy to fall back and rely on editor inheritance so that you take copy and paste sections of CSS in other places just to get the job done. CSS doesn't allow us to create reusable sections in a very straightforward way. This duplication leads to errors because when we make changes, we can't change it in one place and then have those changes propagate to everywhere in the style sheet. So let's take a look at some examples of CSS and see where these pain points really hurt us. So here we are in Visual Studio. We've got a really simple project here. It has an HTML file and then a couple of style sheets that represent the design for our HTML. Here in the HTML file, we've really got 4 links over to style sheets. The first 2 are just links to get some fonts from the Google Web Fonts project. And then the last 2 are our local style sheets that are in our project. The first of these is just a quick init style sheet that's setting up the base properties for all the HTML5 supported elements. We're not going to do really anything with that. We're going to focus on the main.css here to see some of these problems. So let's take a look at our first problem here, which happens to be what I call the color problem, though it relates to a lot of different problems here in CSS, but it's an easy one to take a look at here in colors. We'll notice that if we look at our application real quick, we can see that the HTML page here is being displayed, and it has just a couple of elements, a header on top, a small footer on the bottom, and then a contact form right here in the center. And there's some design elements here to round the corners and to color the fonts in different ways and set the fonts. And we can even see the different form elements are there to allow us to create a real contact page. Here we're going to focus on the design, not actually get this form working. On that page, we notice there are some thematic colors. The background is black. Our text is black. And we're repeating this color both in the container that contains most of our elements, that centered piece of HTML that's in the center of the page, as well as the background here. And this may be thematically a color that you're going to reuse through your application. And this is an important concept. Most websites have a handful of colors they're going to use, unless you're designing something like Reddit where the look doesn't matter and you might have 40 or 50 different colors on a single page. You're going to want to make something appealing, and this is going to have a handful, whether it's 3, 4, 6, sometimes at the most 9 colors that are associated with your application. More importantly, we'd like to be able to take this color that we're using here and reuse it so when we change the color once, we don't have to do copy and replace everywhere. So let's say I wanted to change black as part of our theme here. I would have to actually do search and replace for black, and then let's replace it with red. Now we can see if we run it again, that everything that used to be black is now red. That's because we did search and replace to change those. It would be really nice to actually be able to define those palette colors and use them over and over again. And this doesn't just relate to colors, this really relates to being able to have things like standard widths, standard font sizes, even standard font names in a reusable sense. The colors are about the easiest way to see this, and so it's a nice way to show it to begin with. Now that I've undone all that, we can see we're back to the basic black everywhere because we have that same shared color in that same case. So we can see down here, if we look, that we also have the color blue in a couple of places. And in this case, in the H1 element of the header. But we also are using it in a couple of different places, like the footer. Again, we'd like to be able to reuse these elements. In that same way, hard coding font size, hard coding font families, we'd like to be able to do these in a smaller number of places, again, so that as we decide to change the font name or the font sizes, that we can just have it propagate through our CSS. Another common problem you're going to see in CSS is having duplication of different values in a rule. So in this case, I have a container here that happens to use a border radius, which is something part of the CSS3 spec. But because not every browser is implementing it exactly the same, it's often useful to go ahead and do the Mozilla specific version as well as the WebKit version, and at some point get rid of these two. But every place we need a rounded corner, like we'll see down here, we're using it for our form element, we're going to have to repeat this over and over again. And to have something like a subroutine or like a method that I could call and it would spit this out is more what you'd really want in CSS. When the developer looks at CSS, we start to think of the same things we do in code. We're looking for magic strings to get rid of them so there's only one place, and to take repeatable sections of code and put them in subroutines or methods, or depending on the language you're using. Another issue has to do with what I call cascade avalanches, and that's where you have deeply nested rules that you want to see in a more obvious way. In CSS, you need to take elements, in this case I have an ID I'm looking for called form, and setting a bunch of properties that is putting the form in the center of the page and causing it to be rounded corners and a line being drawn. But inside that form, I want to specify that certain elements are formatted in certain ways. And in this way, I have to write the rules to say inside of a form for this type of control, and then inside of the form again for this area. Later on, as you're trying to maintain this, if you come up here and take a look at this, and let's say we decide to make some change in the HTML, instead of ID form, we're going to call this our contact form. That's not a big change as far as changing the HTML, but when we look at the CSS, it is. Because we not only have to, again, change this to contact form for it to work, but we have to find all instances of the pound form selector and replace them. And there's probably even more than that. Text area for the form, label for the form, and then the validation section for the form. And so we end up again doing a lot of copy and replace, editor inheritance, that is eventually going to bite us. This is a really simple, single page, single CSS with most of our design, but as you build larger and larger applications, you can imagine that doing search and replace across a large application, across a lot of CSS forms, becomes really problematic. Another issue with basic CSS is the ability to do calculations in the CSS. It isn't always the case where you want to specify hard-coded values. Let's take the font size, for example. Here we have 14 point as our basic font size. We could be using M's or other formats as well, but often what we're going to want to do is say, whatever we make as the basic font size of our form, we really want the other things like the H1, H2, H3 elements to follow that. We'd really prefer to say something akin to html.font size plus 8 pixel, right? Be able to write an actual formula here to figure out how these sizes are. Or when you start to get into more complex 2, 3, and 4 columns, be able to calculate those columns on something other than pure percentages, because it may be that you want to base it on exact fixed widths so you don't get the problem of different size browsers are showing it differently, but you still want to actually do calculations based on fixed width. There's no way in CSS to currently do this. We have to do the calculation, usually in our head, and then put the hard-coded value here. Again, one more place that we're going to need to do search and replace so that the CSS can't mature or be maintained in a fairly straightforward way. And finally, let's go back to the form. Let's talk about the way that we're linking our style sheets. Now the first two style sheets here, we actually want to leave the way they are. We're actually pulling them from the Google APIs with the idea that if someone else has downloaded these fonts, that they're going to be cached by the browser, and that's good. But using 2 round trips to really get, an init for those clearances, as well as our real style, or more importantly, in a larger project, there may be dozens of these style sheets, and limiting them to the number of style sheets that you want, would really like to be able to do something like go to the top of our CSS and say import. This actually works. This is valid CSS. The problem is using the init also gets around browser cache. This is actually handled by each of the browsers in a little different way, but it can very easily always make the round trip to the server to get this and just blow out browser cache or not use browser cache. For something as small as an init, maybe that's okay, especially for a smaller site. But if you want to be truly efficient, what you really want this import to do is to take whatever this init file is and just put it in the CSS and maybe even minimize the CSS for you. So you would like the language here to be able to handle making efficient CSS for you so that even though on the server side you're defining what are these individual pieces, combining them together into one file so you get smart caching of that file as well as fewer round trips so your web pages perform better. So those are some of the pain points with CSS, and it would be great if there was a better way, and there is. There's less and Sass. There's 2 languages or dynamic style sheet languages that we're going to be looking at for ways to solve these very specific problems. These languages allow us to improve the lack of common colors by allowing us to create variables that can either be scoped within a rule or even at top level and shared amongst files. It's going to allow us to create reusable parts of the CSS so we can plug them in with variables even to, say, create rounded corners of 5 pixels here and have what makes up a rounded corner be in a single place. So changing it later as browsers mature, or if we have to have some specific things to handle the multi-browser thing, we can create this very easily. These languages also allow us to bring clarity to the rules by allowing them to nest them. So instead of having to repeat the name of the element, we can see visually in the hierarchy of the files exactly how the different rules are related to their parents. Instead of having to read the tedious repeating of the element name and the element type or class, 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 which is very common in CSS. They also allow us to do rich calculations in CSS, and not just add, subtract, multiply, and divide, but also do things like lighten and darken colors, as well as most sort of math equations. They even do a good job of inferring types. So if your font size is in pixels and you say add 24, they'll assume you mean pixels, or would allow you to do things like add 20% to the size of a font instead of having some fixed number that you're adding to it. And finally, they're also going to allow you to combine these in an efficient way so that you're delivering fewer files to the server that contain your resulting CSS. So let's get started next with less and see how less solves these problems.